Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
You're listening to Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. I'm your host, Rob Port. If I sound distracted, it's because I've been busy covering this story all morning. I'm joined by my co-host, Chad Oban.
He's right of center, I'm left of center, both sides of the political spectrum.
I think it's cathartic. I think it's a necessary and proper debate. I'm glad we're having it.
And honestly, we have to do better.
Okay, I don't know why I'm getting blamed for this, right? Today we're going to talk about what my guest co-host Jamie Selzer in our pre-recording discussion described as the most exciting ballot measure on the statewide ballot. I assure you that it is not, but it is important, and we do want to talk about it because I don't want you to go into the ballot box, or maybe you're not going to go into the ballot box. Maybe you're going to vote absentee. You guys know what I did. Normally, I like to go down on election day, and I like to stand in line with everybody. I do. I like the experience. I don't have anything against absentee voting or anything like that. Personally, I normally like to go down and stand in line, and I like the experience, and I like to hear what the people in line are talking about, and I just like it. This year, I did apply for an absentee ballot, though. I'm going to vote remotely this year, so I don't know why. I just decided to do it, so couldn't be bothered, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, I don't want you, when you get your ballot, whether it's in your living room or when you get your ballot down at the local school gym or something from your gym teacher, which is normally how I vote, right? My one year I forgot my ID and my 8th grade gym teacher vouched for me. So that was great. Yeah, that is legal, by the way, under the law. Or was at the time, I think. I hope I didn't just admit to vote fraud. I don't know. Anyway, when you get it,
they're going to come after you, Rob.
They are going to come after me. Yeah. So I don't want you to get the ballot and look and say, what the heck is Measure 3? I should say, by at this point, we're not going to have a full episode on Measure 1. All Measure 1 does is it removes some antiquated language from our Constitution where we're referring to we're using some terms that are seriously outdated for people who have mental health challenges and things like that. So, and words for some facilities and stuff like that. It's just kind of a cleanup. We're going to use modern language. It doesn't really change anything as a matter of law. It's just we're going to have better language in our Constitution. The measures afterwards, we've talked about Measure 2, we've talked about Measure 4, we've talked about Measure 5, that's the recreational marijuana measure. Measure 3 deals with the legacy fund. And I wouldn't blame you if you read the ballot language for Measure 3 and you weren't exactly sure what it is. In fact, I'll read for you. This is what's going to appear on your ballot when you go to vote. It says, I quote, "This constitutional measure would amend and reenact Section 26 of Article 10 of the Constitution of North Dakota relating to spending and transfers from the Legacy Fund. The measure intends to decrease the amount of principal available for spending each biennium and clarify the distributions from the Legacy Fund. The proposed amendments would require transfers and earnings accruing prior to July 1, 2017 to be deemed as the principal of the Legacy Fund, reduce the amount of the principal of the Legacy Fund available to be expended during the biennium from 15% to 5%, require the State Investment Board to invest the monies in the Legacy Fund, not limited to the principal, and on July 1st of odd-numbered years, require the State Treasurer to make a distribution of the Legacy Fund earnings into a Legacy Earnings Fund. The estimated fiscal impact of this is zero, because basically I think it's just kind of moving money around or controlling how we spend the money. Doesn't make it a specific appropriation. Corey, what does that mean? Outgoing Representative Corey Mock, who we brought on because we were concerned we weren't going to be able to fill up enough time on this subject for a full 30 minutes. So we brought on an expert purveyor of pablum, Representative Corey Mock, to explain it all to us. Corey, how are you?
I am very well, and
I will have a full report on the statute of limitations of alleged voter. I don't want to use the orders.
You're gonna get you're gonna get me and Mr. Ormiston in the Hooskow.
If I want to make sure, again, knowing how much time we have dedicated to Measure 3, I know I'm just eating into this this privilege that we have, this allowance. I also once voted without my driver's license. I was at the School for the Blind in Grand Forks. This was I want to say, I think it was 2008. It was 2008 primary election. Maybe 2006. But anyway, I was there and I was out just running errands. Gym shorts, no wallet, didn't have my ID. And I we can vote today. Oh yeah, I'll stop it. I'll vote. And I didn't have it. And there I knew the person there working. They vouched for me. And at the time that was legal. Today it's still legal. I got to think of it, but you have to come back and verify. So you get a provisional ballot.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, at the time.
But then it was, if the poll worker, someone there can vouch for you and say, he is who he says he is, he lives where he says he lives, and they signed the affidavit, they gave you a ballot. So I'm pretty sure, depending on when you did this, you should have been okay, but we'll check the statute.
I don't remember what year it was. I know I was in my 30s and I was still calling my teacher Mr. Ormiston. Because I was afraid if I called him by his first name, he might make me climb the rope again, which didn't happen when I was in middle school, and it's sure as hell isn't going to happen as I am middle age.
As a fellow Husky kid, the rope was the worst day. Like the rope and running the mile were not good days.
I actually was a pretty good runner, and I was a big boy. I was actually in very good shape in high school, and I had no problem running the mile. I had a ton of problem with the rope. I wasn't getting up that rope at all. I don't know who decided we got to make middle school kids. Let's take these kids when they're at one of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. Let's put a big crowd around them and let's give them a physical activity that they're almost certainly not going to be able to do while their peers look on and mock them.
I blame President George H.W. Bush for starting the presidential...
I blame Arnold Schwarzenegger. We got to get on
Arnold with us. That's why.
Okay, we are actually going to talk about Measure 3. Corey, please tell us what this measure is.
Yes. So for the purpose of introduction, Rob, your trusted co-host, or your host, Jamie Selzler, the new Chad Oban of not being introduced as the co-host.
I introduced him as the co-host. I said he was co-hosting.
Didn't you?
Oban's on vacation again, I think.
I thought I missed the full introduction. Jamie Selzler, DNC committee man and co-host of the hour, and then political hospice care providee. Corey Mock, Representative Corey Mock, less than 75 days before I'm out of office. Yes, Measure 3. So you're right, and then for those that are listening to the pod.
Those who are still listening at this point.
Right. If they haven't already skipped ahead or unsubscribed to their feed. Measure 3, as you said, it's an important measure. I hate to say it, but it's a boring measure. And that seems to be where my level of involvement of legislation always seemed to intersect. Was it boring, but somehow important? We're as you said, all it really does is reduce how much of the principal the legislature can spend, how much of the principal every biennium. Now, we could talk more about why that's important and everything else, but that's the biggest change. I should say it also changes the definition of earnings so that we're not having to pull what is considered earnings, how much the fund has made over the last 2 years. We don't have to realize those gains or losses on a specific day. We can smooth the earnings, the fund over 5 years. It's how we manage the Common Schools Trust Fund. So it gives us a cleaner definition for better fund management on earnings. So that's one thing. That's I think the subsection 5 of the text. But I think it would be very important just so that we bring everyone up to speed on the legacy fund itself. So the legacy fund, brought to voters the 2009 legislative session, proposed the legacy fund, lots of back and forth, 100+ pages of committee minutes and amendments back in the day to say, how can we ensure that North Dakota's oil revenue, our oil industry and the money that North Dakota would make from those taxes is always here even after the last drop of oil is pulled out of the ground. So it's a one-time harvest, but let's make sure that it's not just serving a one-time benefit. And that was the legacy fund. It came in 30% of all oil taxes go into the fund, and then they're invested to earn interest. And then the earnings after so many years would start dumping into the general fund so that they could be used for spending. The principle was always there, but you could only, we capped how much the legislature could spend. And the reason then was we weren't saving oil money, at least not the way we were supposed to. We had a statutory savings account, called it the Permanent Oil Trust Fund, but we spent it every year, every biennium. It was like a second general fund. And in that transition from the spend it now fund to the lock it away legacy fund, legislators were worried that what happens if oil tanks like it did in the 80s and we need to balance our budget using some of that principle. They put in 15% as an amount that we could spend if 2/3 of the legislature approved. So it was an escape hatch. It was a break in glass in case of emergency provision. But what we didn't anticipate in 2009 is that the legacy fund that North Dakota Oil would grow and produce as much as it has, and that the legacy fund would grow as quickly as it did. When we first said that the estimates back in 2009, we thought the fund itself wouldn't hit $1 billion until about 2021, 2022. Today, the fund is almost $11 billion. So if you think 15% of $1 billion, 10 plus years after it was created, that would have been 10%. 10% would have been $100 million. 15 would have been $150 million that the legislature could spend. We were spending $300 or so million in oil savings every biennium. So 15% seemed reasonable. Today, 5% is vastly more than what the legislature ever thought they would need. So let alone 15%. 15%, you'd be spending more than $1.5 billion and pulling that out of investments. And it could really deplete the fund rather quickly.
So why, is this what you wanted? Because you had proposed legislation in this vein or in this category, and it got changed quite a bit. Is that my understanding, or am I not remembering right? I mean, is this what you wanted? Is this the correct path in your mind to go?
It is the correct path. It's a good path. We need to do this. It wasn't the intention of the original resolution. So we'd worked on some legacy fund reforms. We couldn't spend any of the earnings for the first 7 years. Everything was reinvested. And then after 7 years, earnings just dumped into the general fund blindly. So it's like having a retirement account or an investment account. And at the end of every year, your fund manager transfers everything you earned that year into your savings account or to your checking account. That's not how people do it. If you want to draw out of your earnings, if you want to draw out of your investments, you can liquidate assets, things like that. So we proposed over the last couple of bienniums requiring the legislature to transfer earnings out. We had to take an action to set how much of the earnings do we want to spend this year. Anything not spent was just reinvested. So you had to make a conscious decision. We worked on that in 2021. House stood by. We really supported it. The Senate was on the fence. We had good support, but ultimately they wanted to see it in a different form. So this last session came in with that as an amendment, but we got to start thinking creatively about the legacy fund. I just don't want to keep coming back and saying, do these, let's just lock it up. So this bill actually came as a new source of revenue to the fund. Right now, it's 30% of oil. Well, we're also making a lot of investments as a state. We're investing in economic development. The legacy fund itself is being used, investments in state, in businesses that are doing business in North Dakota. And our proposal was, let's monetize some of those royalties. So if state funds are being used in economic development, if it's developing intellectual property, if we're a shareholder or an early investor in some companies that are doing business in North Dakota, let's capture some of those returns as an investment and put that into the principal. So that's how this started, was just, hey, no bad ideas in brainstorming. Let's consider some alternative new use or new sources of revenue so that the fund is always here. But as we discussed, that's what came through the House. It went to the Senate. We debated. Ultimately, the goal was to make sure the legacy fund is doing well and doing well for generations. And one simple idea that came forward that none of us were really thinking about was how much of the fund is sitting idle. We didn't realize this. So that 15% that the legislature can theoretically spend doesn't get invested. It sits in cash accounts. And that was a shock to a lot of us. Like, well, wait, what do you mean? And they said, well, theoretically, the legislature can call or spend 15% of the fund at any moment. So instead of having it invested and then having to risk bigger losses if the legislature were to convene in a special session, pull 15% of the fund out, and all of a sudden we're losing investments by cashing them in early, we hold it back in cash reserves. Geez, we don't need to do that. Do we do this with any other fund? And then the short answer is no. So we discussed.
It makes sense that they were doing that, though. I mean, it had to be liquid. It had to be liquid. They didn't. I mean, because if we have it tied up in an investment, and then all of a sudden the legislature says, "Oh," because they have the authority. All of a sudden the legislature says, "We want to spend that 15%," and then they have to go and extricate it from some investment. Maybe there's penalties for that or consequences for that. So they kept it liquid, and that made sense. But essentially what this amendment is saying is we don't need that much to be liquid. We could take a lot more of that and make it part of the principal, part of the investment, and be getting returns on it.
Exactly right. Yeah. So now if this passes, which we hope it does, we would only have to hold 5% back for as liquid assets. And 95% of the fund can be invested. That's a larger return on the investment. The fund will grow incrementally a little bit more every biennium. Compound interest. It's gonna, we're gonna see higher net revenues or rates on return, and the fund is going to be able to kick back a little bit more earnings, a little more in the general fund, a little more spending ability, and hopefully get us to a place where that fund has got a strong, healthy balance for many generations.
Corey, aren't you or others a little worried that we have this fund, this kitty that's getting bigger and bigger with time, while property taxes are killing a lot of folks out there to the point where we might ban them, or at least ban them based on value of the home? And is there a risk that if Measure 4 passes and this Measure 3 passes, it's going to tie the hands of the legislature to make it even more difficult to deal with the financial disaster awaiting us?
If Measure 4 passes, it's going to make the legislature is going to have a lot of difficult decisions to make, and none of them are going to be solved by raiding the legacy fund. None of them are going to be solved long term by raiding the legacy fund, because the fund itself is
long term being the key phrase there. I don't think they're going to care about long term in the next.
It's not going to survive. It won't survive 10 years. If the legacy fund principle is what's used to balance the fiscal effects of Measure 4 and still spend everything else that comes forward, the legacy fund is just as well get rid of the purpose. It's not going to be there for future generations. So if Measure 4 passes, we shouldn't be using the principle of the legacy fund to balance the books. we have to think long term on any account, any investment account. You don't cash it in the first 10 years, 20 years. This is a sovereign wealth fund. This is North Dakota's ability for our oil industry, for that, again, that one-time harvest, to be here for generations. And if we let it grow and use those earnings as intended, in a pretty short period of time, it's going to be probably the largest single contributor to the general fund. It'll outpace sales tax in 10, 20 years. So that's the reason this is so important. Property taxes, and I hate to say this as a legislator, but the legislature is seriously overstepped in our commitment to offset property taxes, or to subsidize or reduce. It's not a tax we collect. We don't control the spending side of the ledger. And for us to come in and try to solve a problem that we don't control, I hate to say it, but it's a recipe for disaster, and we're never going to get ahead of it. Measure 4 is an overcorrection in solving the problem, but the legislature is going to have to take a long and hard look at how we support local tax relief without doing it in an uncontrollable way. And that's a much bigger challenge that we have before us.
It's interesting to me what the legacy fund has become in North Dakota political debates. It's kind of this deus ex machina, where anything that you're proposing, if it's new spending or you want to eliminate a tax or something, it's like, don't worry, we have the legacy fund to pay for it all. Don't worry about the $3 billion in revenues that we're eliminating by abolishing the tax on property values. We have the legacy fund, right? It's this very convenient rhetorical device that you can deploy in just about any situation to say, we have billions of dollars stacked up over here. We could do whatever we want. And listen, I always something like, I was opposed to the legacy fund. Way back in when it was on the ballot. I don't necessarily like the idea of the state just taking tax dollars from anybody, whether they're oil companies or farmers or whoever, and just seeing how high we can stack them. A lot of times I would rather that money be left, but we have it now. Not advocating cutting off our nose to spite our face. So if we're going to have a sovereign wealth fund, we have to remember our sovereign wealth fund is still like a preteen, right?
It's a newborn,
right?
I mean, I'd say it's preschool. We'll say it's preschool.
What we need is for this thing to mature, right? We need it to keep growing so that the principal becomes large enough. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it's kicking off significant revenues now, but large enough where those revenues could be used in some significant way. And I do, like, it gives me heartburn when I think of like how easy it is sometimes to amend our state constitution. That's what Measure 2 is about. I don't know that Measure 2 is the right solution either, but you think about the initiated measure process, and we have like $1 billion or multiple, like $11 billion and hundreds of millions of dollars a biennium that it kicks off in earnings. And it's just sitting there for the most part. I'm worried that somebody's going to walk through our initiated measure process and spend that for us. And just come up with something like, let's whack it up and give every North Dakotan a check. That worries me a lot.
Rob, I have a question for you, and Corey, you may know this as well. You have to educate me in this. I know you're obviously originally from Alaska, and there's talk about they have a fund, and I think it kicks off individual payments.
So the permanent fund, we call it.
The permanent, okay. And I'm not sure what that balance is. That's payments to individuals as well.
Yeah, it's so I could tell you that when I lived in Alaska, the last year I got a permanent, they call it the permanent fund dividend. So the last year I got a permanent fund dividend check as a citizen of Alaska. I was 10 years old, and it was $1,100. It's a significant amount. Now it's gone down since then, even as inflation has gone up, because it's the earnings. During that time, they were having a particularly good earnings back now. But I think the fund is like 30 or 40 billion. I think I would have to change. It's been a long time since I've looked. One of the reasons why, because the permanent fund in Alaska always comes up in the context of North Dakota's legacy fund. And I have a philosophical issue with talking about them as though that they were the same, because they are very different types of revenue. In North Dakota, the legacy fund is funded primarily by a tax on the oil industry, on oil production. That goes into a percentage of that goes into the legacy fund. In Alaska, those are oil royalties. So this is oil and gas development that has happened on state-owned lands in Alaska, which in Alaska is a lot of land. I mean, there's a lot of, it's not like North Dakota where most of the land's privately owned. In Alaska, most of the land is just like state or federal. It's just nobody owns it other than the taxpayers. So what happens is when the oil industry came in, a lot of where they were doing oil and gas exploration were in places where not a lot of people lived and nobody owned the land. And so the state was getting those royalties, and they decided, well, since this land belongs to the taxpayers, let's just treat all the taxpayers like they own the oil royalties, and we cut them checks. That's what they're doing. To me, that's fundamentally different. Our equivalent to that would be our Common Schools Trust Fund, right, where we put revenues from North Dakota's royalties for oil development, which are much smaller than the state of Alaska's because we have far fewer royalties. So I have a problem taxing one group of people and then just giving the money to another group of people. I don't like that. I don't mind the idea of all North Dakotans own this land, so if the land produces revenues, then all North Dakotans get a part. If that was it, I would be fine. But anyway, that's my rant about as a former Alaskan, that's the distinction between the permanent fund and the legacy fund.
And it's a very good and important distinction. The other thing, and I wish I had updated numbers on this, but I know when we've talked about this over the last several years, Alaska is not as flush with cash as they were when they proposed the dividend. The fund itself was created before a dividend was given. So it had grown, and then several years into that fund existing, that's when a dividend of cutting a check every year to every Alaskan was, it was born. It came out as you said, it's a state-owned resource, a mineral. We're getting royalties on that. Let's give it back to the taxpayers in the form of a dividend check. The state was using some of those proceeds, the returns, the earnings, for state fund purposes, and then you add on a dividend check. It truncated the growth of the fund, and it's with changes in tax structures, elimination of some other base taxes, stagnation of their own oil development. The fund isn't keeping up, and you've had legislative races, gubernatorial races. It's all about how do you balance this budget? We're going to have you raise taxes. What's the future of the permanent dividends? Alaska found itself in a situation where they're struggling to fulfill all of those financial commitments.
The permanent fund balance is currently at about $79 billion, and the 2024 permanent fund dividend checks are about $1,700 a person, which sounds nice, but if you consider, I mean, the last one I got was $1,100 in 1990. So if you calculate for inflation, I got more in 1990 than Alaskans are today in 2024. That's the trajectory is what Alaskans are getting. It's going down. And maybe some of it's, there's population growth to consider and everything else. But it's, and it also, you want to talk about North Dakota's legacy fund being a political football. Think about all the people up there who are campaigning on, I'll give you a bigger permanent fund check, right? And stuff like that, which might not be responsible fiscal policy, but I gotta think that's probably a popular proposal among some voters.
By the way, Rob, $1,100 check when I was 10 years old would have bought me a lot of baseball cards and Mountain Dew.
I will tell you that I didn't get that $1,100. I didn't get that $1,100 check. My parents got that $1,100 check. I'm not sure where it went. So I have a feeling it went into remodeling the. I seem to remember the living room getting new hardwood floors. So I feel like that's where my permanent fund check went.
I believe I think we all agree that Raleigh Port is probably a better manager of those funds than past Rob, Jamie, or Corey ever would have been at that age.
All I'm saying is I would have been a financial boon to the Piggly Wiggly on 16th Street.
It's Aladdin's castle at the Dakota Square Mall that would have been the beneficiary of my.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I will tell you that I am not complaining because on the ledger of what my parents have given me versus what I've given them, there is a deficit on my side of the ledger for sure. So Well, we're going to put a pin in that. I think we explained what this is. I think it's a good idea. Like I said, it's not super sexy, but I think it makes sense. It allows us to invest the principal. Like it makes the process more efficient. We still have funds available if the emergency happens and the legislature needs to dig in. They can still do it. It's just that the legacy fund is a different animal now than what we considered it would be when it first started. So we're just changing some of the numbers around. It's a good thing. Everyone, I'm going to vote for it. Corey, I know you're voting for it. Jamie?
Yep.
I guess I'll vote for it to be nice. Hard. No, I'm just kidding. Of course I'll vote for it. I was a huge believer in the legacy fund, so anything that builds that
I feel like everything I learned about the legacy fund back, actually, if we really wanted to nerd out, and if there's ever a podcast in North Dakota that would do it, it's this one. And we just get chatted on this, and he was just as involved. There was a measure in 2008 that was the precursor to the legacy fund. That was a vote no. Yeah, everyone was. It was the original attempt, but it didn't have a lot of the relief valves, the precautions that we needed. So there was a big push to kill that measure so we could do it better the next time. And Chad, I think, was even part of the vote no on whatever that fund was. I forget the measure number, but we could really nerd out about the history of the legacy fund. Give us another half hour and we'll make sure that no one ever has a hard time sleeping in the state ever again.
Yeah.
By the way, I was going to say, before we wrap up, Corey, I just want to say, I remember 2007 sitting down at Peacock Alley in Bismarck going over a pros and cons list for you running for the legislature back then. And I know you're done this year, closer to 20 years now that you've been there. Just want you to know that super proud of you, the work you've done. It's not easy to put. I respect any party who puts themselves out there the way they did. Obviously, you're highly respected by both parties. You were the leader of the Democrats for a while. And so you've really, you've far exceeded any expectations I would have had for you when you ran. So I just want to thank you for your years of service and let you know I'm proud of you.
I appreciate that. I mean, the self-deprecation, but slight honesty, I probably exceeded any expectations by coming in first place on November 4th of 2008. That was probably a shock to you and most everyone else. But no, that really means a lot.
I mean, expectations weren't real high to begin with. So
exactly right. Yeah, under promise, over deliver. And if I had a family coat of arms, that's what it would say right over the top.
And I just want to say I don't agree with anything Jamie just said, and good riddance.
I could have elected a Rockland legislature as a Democrat in 2008. So, but other than that, I think you did a great job.
Well, that's kind of you. Yeah, I appreciate it. And I look forward to, we'll probably talk a little bit more over the next couple of weeks, whether it's intentional or not, about Measure 3. Hopefully get some more, numbers on what it could mean. But I think it's a good measure. I hope that people can support it. Tell your friends. It's not sexy. It's not going to overpower the airways with ads. But I think it's important to North Dakota's future and making sure that we're managing the funds correctly.
Well, that's one. I mean, what kind of a rule of thumb I have with ballot measures is usually people's default position, especially if they don't understand them, is no. Yeah. So that's one thing is I do want people to understand this because this is a step in the right direction, and I want people to understand it and vote yes. So, Corey, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
As always, appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
The cold cases you see at the Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At the Vault podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out the Vault at inforum.com/the Vault and subscribe to the Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
Welcome back. That was a scintillating discussion about Measure 2, Measure 3. Measure 3. My goodness. So I think it's a good idea. I think it's moving us in the right direction. But let's shift gears. Let's talk about some of what's going on at the national level, because I got to tell you, Jamie, when I started writing about politics, 22 years ago, I didn't think that we were going to be in a position where I'm writing about serious presidential candidates at the top of the ticket talking about people eating dogs and cats and things. I didn't think, and like not just one offhand remark, but like driving entire news cycles with this. And for people who are saying, oh, it's just the media that's obsessed about this, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump chose to keep bringing this up, right? It had been in the news for a while, and then Donald Trump brought it up in what was probably one of the most watched presidential debates in history, brought it up in that context. I don't understand why we're talking about this. It's absurd. In fact, the Republican governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, has an op-ed in the New York Times today basically saying, listen, I support Donald Trump, but these stories are bogus and they're not helping. And we have bomb threats on schools and bomb threats on City Hall. We had to close hospitals and everything because of they have convulsed people and convinced them that something is happening in Springfield, Ohio, that's not happening. I don't know. I mean, it feels cliche at this point to feel like I'm through the looking glass, Jamie, but it's like every once in a while you just stop and it's like, this is American politics right now? This?
It's insanely sad. Going back to even 2016, I've never been one of these folks that just attacks Trump supporters for being Trump supporters. I've always tried to kind of understand where they're coming from and why they've supported Donald Trump throughout time. And the Trump of this year compared to the Trump of 2015, 2016 are incredibly different. And I look back at those days and think about some of the crazy stuff, offensive stuff that he said. I remember thinking, like, I think it's horrifically bad, but I can understand why people are supporting him because he's speaking to a group of people that haven't been spoken to in a while in a language that they use themselves. And I remember thinking in 2016, the Clinton campaign I didn't think she was going to lose, but I thought they weren't really respecting the viewpoint that Trump and his supporters had. Fast forward to now, and I'm literally in disbelief some days that he's kept 35, 40% of the population while saying truly insane things and deeply offensive things. If you look back over history, when it comes to groups that are hated or marginalized, oppressed, or killed in genocide, they often start with what are people eating and using food. And people can go study the history on this. And it might seem silly, but it's deeply offensive and scary how this could go off the rails.
I wrote about it. There is a very ugly history of it. One of the longest and most pernicious examples of this is the blood libel against Jewish people, which has been around since, I think, like the 12th century. And essentially what it was a smear suggesting that Jewish people were kidnapping Christians, in particular Christian children, and sacrificing them, and then using their blood to make like matzah or traditional Jewish dishes. This has persisted up to the modern time, and even you can see echoes of it in Donald Trump's movement, where you talk about some of the QAnon people who talk about how there's Hollywood elites. Well, who controls Hollywood? Well, the Jewish people do, in their mind. Hollywood elites are kidnapping people and stealing adrenochrome from them, right? That's just a variation on the blood libel. This has been around. This impulse to slander a group of people as a political tactic is a tale of as old as time, and it works with depressing regularity.
Yeah, it's one of these things where it's like, on one hand, I've laughed at jokes about this. People use it as a way to mock Trump or J.D. Vance, and I get the desire to do that, and I get why some of the jokes are funny. But the underlying thing here is this is not a funny thing. We have someone who wants to be the leader of the free world, who is continuing to share things that it's just not true. Forget the fact that it's a deep offense; they're just not true. And it's based in, like, the kernel of truth. There are some people in Springfield who are essentially, or at least one person maybe took a goose from a park, which is illegal, but think how many North Dakotans go out and hunt geese every year.
I feel like poaching geese, again, not condoning it, kind of happens with regularity though. Like, I don't know why that's, and one of the things that drives me nuts is J.D. Vance, of all people. Like, if you look at another example, think about the Hillbilly Highway, right? Think about the post-World War II Appalachian diaspora, where you had people leaving the mountains because they were desperate, they needed work. And one of the places they went was Springfield, Ohio, because Ohio has always had, a strong manufacturing base, lots of jobs like that, lots of labor jobs. And so the hillbillies went there, and they weren't all that unlike the Haitians in that they had thick accents that were sometimes hard to understand. They had sometimes exotic religious rituals that involved animals, right? The snake handling and some of the Pentecostal stuff. They even ate animals that maybe their neighbors didn't think of as food, like squirrels and possum.
Raccoons. I lived in Appalachia. People would people drive by. There's a raccoon, a dead raccoon on the side of the road. They'd stop and grab it for food.
Yeah, I'm not judging. I'm just saying that. I mean, this is a guy who wrote a book about it, Hillbilly Elegy. Like, you wrote a book about this. You know how your quote unquote hillbilly ancestors were treated, and now you're doing the same thing to Haitians. Why? Because of their skin color? Why?
It's this anti-immigrant, and things. They're not even. They're here legally as well. So it's like they're trying to turn this into like illegals are taking over Springfield, killing dogs and cats. None of which is true.
I don't know if you saw J.D. Vance was at a. It must have been some sort of a town hall, and somebody from the audience asked him a question like, "Okay, you've clearly got an issue with these Haitian people in Ohio. So what would you do about them? Understanding that they're here legally, like they have legal status in the United States." And part of his answer was, "Well, I don't care about that. I'm still going to call them illegals." What?
No.
Like I understand you could disagree with the policy. That's valid. I don't agree with you, but if you don't like the refugee policy, okay, that's understandable. But the law is what it is. Their status is not in doubt. They're here legally. Any children they have while they're here are going to be Americans. So I don't understand how you could just do that. And I think it's just they're getting around the fact that they are here legally. These folks are not breaking any laws. In fact, they came to Springfield, and if you listen to Springfield officials and you listen to the governor of Ohio, who, by the way,
and the Republican mayor,
and I mean these are Republican officials, most of them. And by the way, the governor, Mike DeWine, born in Springfield and lived most of his life within 10 miles in a small town outside of Springfield, which I learned reading his New York Times piece today. I mean, these are people who should not, like, they're Republicans. And what they're saying is this helped. We needed workers. They're workers. They came here. They got jobs. And if you listen to people who own like apartment buildings and stuff, they were saying, listen, I used to have to participate in low-income housing programs to get tenants in. Now I have Haitians who have paychecks who could just rent the apartment, and I don't have to participate in the programs. I mean, Republicans of another era would point at this and say, this is the market working. This is the market taking people, giving them jobs, making them self-sufficient, and reducing the need for government services, right? This is the Republican argument. Unfortunately, Trump and Vance aren't those Republicans. These are different Republicans now.
And, it's interesting. I mean, it's a political tactic. And if you look at how these campaigns are running, the Trump-Vance campaign is clearly trying to divide. They're doing whatever they can to divide, to rile up their base. The Harris campaign, and I'm a DNC National Committee man. I get it. Like I'm a partisan here. She really is trying to unite. She's trying to bring Republicans in. I mean, last night she did a Oprah special, and Oprah said, "I didn't know you had a gun." And she's like, "If you break into my house, I'm shooting you." I'm like, is this like Al Carlson, come back to, as a presidential candidate? Like, she's trying to unite people. He's trying to divide.
And you and I have talked about this. I think that this is such a smart move. I hope she's telling the truth about being a gun owner, but that aside, I like that Democrats aren't going to treat gun owners like they're immediately criminals anymore. I shouldn't paint with such a broad brush. But there is certainly a very vocal faction of Democrats who think that gun ownership is not a good thing. Maybe not Democrats from around North Dakota, but I mean, sometimes those loud voices speak for the party. Sure. And I like the idea that, like, patriotism isn't something to be ashamed of anymore. Like, it's okay to think America's a great place. And when you say America's a great place, an American is a great thing to be, that doesn't mean that you're looking aside or looking past all of our very real problems and some of our ugly history. We can acknowledge we're far from perfect, but this is still a great place to live. And I think Democrats have been missing that puzzle piece. And I don't think they're being intentionally unpatriotic. That's not my argument. I'm just saying they could wave the flag a little more.
And I think I agree. First of all, I think she is telling the truth. I'm mindful of the fact that she was a prosecutor for many years and was probably under threat and so on.
I have no reason to doubt it.
Yeah. But in terms of the kind of the patriotism flag waving thing, certainly the Republicans, probably starting with Reagan, really became the party of the patriot. And Democrats were and are, but I think Democrats maybe define patriotism differently. Democrats have always defined patriotism as being willing to question your country and say that we're wrong, say that maybe we're not the best in the world at something, is acknowledging that as a way to become better at it. But I think under the Trump years, and I'm probably guilty of this as well, both sides became a little bit of if they're for it, then I'm against it. And, I think that Democrats aren't immune from that. And I think the harder that the Trump side, the MAGA world went into we're America-loving, flag-waving patriots. And if it got to be for a while that if you had a flag from your car or from your boat or whatever, you must have been a MAGA person. And I agree. I think that there's no reason for Democrats to run from that the way we did. But I think it's just a reaction to saying we don't want to be associated with these people. We're not going to get on board.
I understand that. But I think for me, the really frustrating one was the debate over the Colin Kaepernick thing. And it was I think it's possible to believe that, yes, we have problems with the way law enforcement treats minority communities. Yes, we have a problem with the way our criminal justice system treats minorities and a lot of other factions in our society that draw. Yes, we have those problems, and still think that kneeling during the national anthem is a disrespectful thing to do. Again, supporting his First Amendment right to do so. But when I made that argument, my liberal friends were just immediately there was no room for nuance. I think you put it exactly right. And I have accused Trump supporters of doing it. It's because you are just reflexively against whatever our friends on the left are for, you've allowed them to define you, right? You're defining yourself as just by opposition to them, and then you become the thing that they accuse you of being. That's what happens. And I think that's happened on the right and the left, where the right started becoming the nativists and kind of bigots in some ways that the left accused them of being, and the left in some ways kind of started becoming the anti-patriotic people that the right accused them of being in extreme cases. I mean, remember that we're talking about extreme cases here, but I feel like the blank slate thing, and I know Harris is getting a lot of flack for talking to the media, and listen, as a member of the media, she should be more open. I mean, as a matter of civics, she should be more open. As a matter of politics, it's a very smart thing for her to be doing right now.
Making the right call. Yeah.
She's making the right call to win the election, and hey, you can't govern if you don't win the election. But I have appreciated that. I think there is something to this blank slate thing where she is allowed to be the sort of Democrat that maybe we haven't seen in a while.
Well, I mean, I think the most recent example of this was Barack Obama, that sort of came out of nowhere. And I think when you are a blank canvas, people put their own philosophies and beliefs and hopes and dreams onto you. Obviously, it worked out incredibly well for Barack Obama. I think it will for Harris as well.
Well, let's have a corollary to that, because if you look at what happened down ballot from Barack Obama, it didn't work out so well for Democrats. When you look at the number of legislative seats that they lost.
2010. I mean, 2010 was the worst year Democrats have ever had.
And that's the thing, is I think some of Barack, he didn't necessarily bring that blank canvas stuff into, and listen, presidents can't be a blank canvas. Eventually you have to govern. So that's what I would really like from, even though Kamala Harris, I understand she's a Democrat, most of her policies I'm not going to like because I'm just a different ideology, but I would like her approach. She needs to bring this from the campaign into governing. It can't be election day happens, she's sworn in, hopefully there's a peaceful transition of power. That's a whole other topic. But when she's in office, she has to continue it. It can't go to the Barack Obama, I won. She can't do that. That would be a mistake.
Yeah. I was talking to someone about this, a mutual friend of ours about this last night, and we were talking about Doug Burgum as it relates to all of this stuff and how, I said I bet that, well, who knows, maybe now with Vance going off the rails the way he is, that Trump doesn't feel this way. But I'm guessing that at certain points throughout the last couple of months, Trump has wished he had picked Doug Burgum rather than J.D. Vance as his VP pick. And wondering, and the friend asked, what's going to happen to Doug Burgum if Trump loses? Like, if he wins, obviously Doug will end up in the cabinet. But what's going to happen to him if he loses? Is he going to come back to Fargo? Where I can tell you, I live in Fargo, I live in downtown Fargo. He's not going to be super welcome walking around downtown here. He's going to get some comments. But anyway, and what I said is the Doug Burgum story is going to be being more sad, because if he had not gone so deep into this Trump world, I'm not talking endorsing. Endorsing is fine. That's just your candidate. But like going to the trial and calling it a sham and all of the insanity that Doug has done since, Doug would have been a fantastic token Republican in a Democratic administration. He would have been like the Commerce Secretary. I'm sure that he would have been someone that they would have picked for it, because he's was a reasonable. He was a decent governor, a reasonable leader. He would have been picked. Now that's not going to happen.
I think what's gotten in Doug's way is his ambition. Because when I have talked to people from Burgum world who are around him, what they tell me is that, he kind of chafes at the idea that he should be Secretary of Energy or Secretary of Agriculture. Like those are second tier cabinet jobs. He wants, and by the way, Secretary of Agriculture is a working cabinet job. Like, that's a job. The Department of Agriculture is huge. And those people work and they travel constantly. He didn't want that. He wants a plum. He wants Secretary of State, which is why, by the way, I think that's why he's in Israel, is because, he's over there. Obviously, the eyes of the world are on the Israel Palestinian conflict. And that's why he's there, is he's making the case for himself as Secretary of State. Now, and who knows who Trump would pick? I don't know. I don't know. It's amazing to me that Trump gets all this credit for being a businessman. His hiring in the political realm has not been good. When you look at the number of people who served in his administration who don't want him reelected, including his own vice president, including Chris Christie, who was on his transition team, including, General Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense. I could go down the list.
And Trump trashes all these people, and every time he does, I'd be like, who hired these idiots? Like, oh, wait, like, I now know who hired these idiots. So just, I don't know what's going to come out of this, but I think it's not going to end with Doug being in a cabinet one way or the other.
You don't think
it's
so?
Not seeing Trump win. No, I don't. I just don't. I don't think Trump is going to win. And I don't know. I would have been proud to see a Doug Burgum as a Republican in a Democratic cabinet. Just as a North Dakotan, I would have been happy about that. But I don't feel it's.
I have such a hard time because I do. I think the polling's really good for Kamala Harris, especially when we're seeing. People talk about the national poll all the time. National poll doesn't. It matters, but it's not the poll to look at. What you want to look at is she winning in battleground states? And some of these polls showing her she's got three or 4 or 5 point lead in Pennsylvania. She's leading in Michigan. North Carolina suddenly got very interesting, where all of a sudden the Republican gubernatorial candidate, who Donald Trump helped beat a normie Republican in the primary, came out to be a big fan of a porn forum where he was calling himself a black Nazi and everything. Like, that guy is at the top.
Not a good look. Not a good look.
And North Carolina, that could be the deciding state, right? That's a key battleground state. It's interesting to see what that's going to do to Trump in that state. But the problem is I feel like I'm in a horror movie, and it's like, oh, good, Jason Voorhees is at the bottom of the lake now. We don't have to worry about him anymore. And then he's like standing right behind you. Like, I feel like that's how it is with Trump. Every time we feel like this guy's done, like he just attempted a coup. Surely he's not coming back again. Well, you turn around and he's standing there again. So I just.
Yeah, I think, no, I get it.
I have PTSD. Can you tell I have PTSD? That's what
I get it. If you look at the last few elections, Trump, his actual results tend to outperform the polls by 3 or 4%. I think because there's always been this factor where people didn't want to admit that they were going to vote for him. And so that's what they would tell pollsters. So we always did better in the results in the polls. I don't think we're going to see that this time. I think there might be a bit of an opposite effect. I think
people think January 6th is in the rearview mirror. You got to remember, this is the first time he's been on the ballot again since January 6th. I mean, yes, it was 4 years ago, but that was the last time he was on the ballot. He has not been on the ballot again since.
I think people are getting just bored. I think they're getting bored. And I think the Dobbs decision, with abortion is going to have a larger impact. It's going to have a huge impact. I think there are plenty of women and lots of men who are, when they're in that privacy of the voting booth, are going to say, I just don't want to deal with this anymore. I'm done with it. I've been involved in politics now. My first campaign was 1994, Gary Porter for Congress back in Minot. I was a little 15-year-old going into volunteer. And so during that time, I've worked with a lot of candidates who talk about yard signs. And I always roll my eyes. I get frustrated because people put more effort into yard signs than they do into actually going out and talking to voters. So I think it's not a good indicator of success. That said, go to Bismarck or go to a Fargo, or even a place like North Dakota, you don't see Trump signs anymore. I mean, you do, but just way fewer than used to be. And there are more North Dakotans for Harris Walls. For every Trump sign you see, there are multiple Democratic signs. Now, I don't think this means, he's going to win North Dakota. But I think it's an indicator that in lots of the country, there are people who are more willing to say, yeah, I'm going to be for Democrats this year. At least give them a chance. I think she's going to win the popular vote by 10 plus million. It's going to still be a battle in a lot of these states, but people are tired of Donald Trump, unless you're part of that core 35%.
As somebody and like I've been involved in politics, but I've never run. My role's always been observer. But as somebody who is, I read an article recently that Trump is not, because basically the Republican National Committee belongs to Trump now, right? His people run it. It's the party's his. He has directed the party to invest money in lawyers to litigate mail-in ballots and absentee ballots and voting laws and all that stuff. And they're pulling money from get out the vote efforts. And I heard that and I'm thinking they're doing that because I think, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I thought they're doing that because they don't think he's going to win. And so this is just about shoring up his ego again, right? I think 2020 was about shoring up his ego. I think it's dangerous, given where we're at and the baseless accusations of vote fraud that they make all the time. By the way, there's a great documentary out on HBO now about Stop the Steal and that whole movement that you need to watch, because you got to remember the people who held the line after the 2020 election in some of these key places were Republicans, right? It was the Republican Speaker of the House in Arizona who refused to play ball with Trump and replace Arizona's electors. It was a Republican Secretary of State in Georgia who refused to play ball. And his, I forget what his name, he had a commissioner of elections that worked under him who was also a Republican who held the lines. And I'm not trying to make a partisan point here. I'm just saying these were people who were Trump supporters and they valued their duty to the country above, partisan loyalty. They did the right thing. They looked at it and they were even open to the idea that they were fraud. They held multiple recounts. They did audits. They held hearings and they looked at it and there was there's no evidence here. So yeah. I just, I don't know what point I was trying to make, but
Rob,
I think it's a terrible idea to pull money away from get out the vote efforts, though, in an election this close.
You want to win.
Terrible.
Yeah. Well, I'm a DNA member. I've been involved in the voter protection stuff over the last month. And I'll tell you, just talking to, every region has a assigned staff person attorney who's helping every state with our voter protection efforts to essentially make sure that people, the laws are followed and people get to vote. And in talking with him, and I talked about this, we had a state central committee meeting with Democrats this weekend, and I talked about it is what we're hearing from, I think I can probably talk about this, what we're hearing in the DNC and through our attorneys is it's not just the battleground states where Republicans are preparing to contest the election and say that it was stolen. They're doing it in places like Wyoming. They're doing it in places like North Dakota, where we're now having to put a stronger effort into finding election judges to make sure that we have our own observers there who can contacted our attorney if we need to say, hey, they're not following the law. Like there was a situation in Fargo in the previous election where they weren't following the law with asking for like proof of citizenship, something like that. So stuff like that's happening all over. And the thought process and why the DNC is nervous about this and why they're putting money into it is, if you are Trump world, MAGA world, and you can start saying they are stealing the election. Look what they're doing in Fargo, North Dakota. The Democrats are stealing votes in Fargo or in Cody, Wyoming, or not the swing states. Now you're creating this nationwide narrative that they're not just doing it in Michigan, they're doing it everywhere. And that's scary if that's the path they're going down. And we're preparing for that as Democrats. We're preparing to be accused of having elections stolen, even in North Dakota.
And one of the things you got to remember is American elections are very, very distributed in terms of authority, right? I mean, yeah, each state has a secretary of state or some other official who's in charge of the elections. But then you drill down and there's like county auditors, or some places will have like a board of supervisors that's specifically for elections. I think that's how they do it in Arizona. I mean, it's very distributed. But where the rubber meets the road, down at the bottom, a lot of the people are volunteers. And they get training and everything. That's how it is. But like, we were joking at the beginning of the show about like our former teachers there. Like, they're not professionals. They're people who volunteered. And we have two problems. First of all, when you're dealing with volunteers, sometimes they make mistakes. They're human beings. It's not part of some nefarious scheme to suppress the vote. Sometimes maybe the training just didn't come through, or they made a mistake, or you get a bad apple. I don't know. It happens. But it's not. But the problem is in this media environment, somebody on Twitter can seize on a little thing like that and then extrapolate from it some massive conspiracy that just doesn't exist. But because some bozo somewhere didn't do it quite right, and by the way, there's always there's all sorts of safeguards. Like in North Dakota, we tabulate the ballots by machine, but you know what we keep? The paper ballots. And if we need to, we can go to those paper ballots and we can look and we can count them up. And
I've been part of 4 recounts in North Dakota.
Yeah.
Our process works really well here.
And that was one of the things. I mean, there was a county auditor in I don't even want to say what county now because I'm forgetting. It was a very rural county in kind of the middle, the rural eastern part of the state, who was basically driven out of. She quit. She quit because she was being hounded by local people who are insisting that North Dakota's election machines could be hacked and everything else, which is not true, by the way. I mean, they've been the auditor Gallion looked at them. There's all sorts of safety guards and checks and everything against that. But I mean, that's what worries me too. Is I mean, you're talking about like finding election judges or people to go in and participate in this process. How many of them got to be scared? Like if I make a human mistake and somebody records me and posts it on Twitter, and now I got to live years of my life being hounded because Tucker Carlson put it on his show or something.
Or maybe Donald Trump says my name. Right. And that I am stealing the election.
That's, by the way, if you watch that documentary on HBO, you're going to hear from people like that who they had video of this like election official. He's like, normally I don't get a lot of attention. Not a lot of people come. Like, this is a low profile job. I didn't get elected to this job. It was like the board of supervisors, I think they call it. And he's like, I didn't get elected to this job for the prestige. I'm a Republican and I'm just trying to serve. And he had people like trying to break into his house and do a citizen's arrest. He had cops outside, like a mob of people. He was in Maricopa County and they're trying to hold him back and keep him out of his house. I mean, there were probably volunteers thinking, even in North Dakota, like, do I want to be a part of that? Because some rando records 15 seconds of video of me making a mistake, or just takes it out of context and makes it look like I'm doing something wrong, even though I'm not. I mean, what a terrible time.
Yeah, I mean, just to step back to like the question you asked that started all this, I'm hopeful at some point people, voters, just Americans need to step back, and maybe they're going to do it in the ballot box, where they're going to say, is this who we are? Like, we have to have a bit of a reckoning. Is this who we are? And if Donald Trump wins again, I think the answer is, I guess so. Probably, if this is who we are. Like, I fundamentally don't believe that, though. But I think everyone has to, rather than point to like some national thing, everyone has to make a decision. And I think that even applies in North Dakota. where I tell folks who are not Democrats that they should really consider voting for Kamala Harris, not because it's going to win her the election here. I'll be the first to acknowledge it's not what North Dakota is. But I think there is power in numbers in saying, even in North Dakota,
Trump only got 50%
of the vote. Yeah.
Only got 52, right?
Exactly. I think that, and I care a lot about history and how history looks at this time. And I want history to look back and say, when we were faced with a difficult decision and a real choice in our country, we chose the right thing everywhere. And I know that's my hope. And I'm aware that, I come from a partisan viewpoint, and I know that not everyone's going to agree, but I worry a bit about the future. I don't have kids, so I'm not thinking about this in terms of like, I don't intend on having any kids, so I don't think about what are my kids going to inherit, but I think about that for people who have kids or grandkids.
Well, you don't have to have kids to care about future generations of Americans.
No, of course not. No, yeah.
I do have kids, so that runs through my mind all the time. And I also think about, as someone who is vocally and very visibly involved in politics, I want my children or my grandchildren who go to the library and look up past newspaper articles or whatever and see that their grandpa was on the right side. I will never have to explain why. I mean, listen, I've taken some controversial positions over the years. I know that. Not everybody likes them, and maybe some of them aren't going to age well. But when the rubber hit the road, I wasn't on the side of the people who were going to take an immigrant community who frankly, I mean, the Haitians, they may have well been the Scandinavians of another era. They may as well have been the Irish or the Chinese or the Vietnamese or whoever, Koreans or whoever, or Libyans, or, it's just, they're us. And they just want to, they want to become Americans. They just want opportunity. They want a place to live, a place to work, and a place to hopefully, move the needle and start their kids ahead of where they started. That's all they want. And just, I will never have to say I supported that. I supported the nativists. I will never have to say that. We should probably...
My great-great-grandparents moved to North Dakota and literally harvested cattle bones from fields in western North Dakota. That's what they did. They walked fields looking for bones to somehow turn those into money, to sell them and turn them into money. And that's how the Selzler family started in North Dakota. And I am grateful while I am sure there were people like Donald Trump and his most extreme supporters around back then, I am grateful they were not in power, because I feel like my family's done a lot of good in North Dakota over the years. Nothing spectacular, but just lived lives, built businesses, did whatever. And the Selzer story is the same as thousands and thousands and thousands of other stories in North Dakota. This started in the early 1900s with immigrants coming from Europe. And what stories are we going to miss out on if we continue going down this nativist, isolationist thing? Is it going to be the grandkid of one of these immigrants that cures cancer one day? And I think about that, and I wish that the Trump supporters would just look at themselves in the mirror and say, is this who I want to be? And decide, no, this is not.
I wish Doug Burgum would do that, because I think he's a better person than this.
I do too.
But I wish he would. And by the way, the Port family, I can't trace it back that far. They wandered out of the French-Canadian wilderness sometime in the 19th century and started stealing people's horses. So they were kind of the lockup, like that saying, like lock up your daughters. That's who they were about, is the Ports. We probably should have deported them. Anyway. All right. We're going to put a pin in it there. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk again. That's it for today on Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. Plain Talk is a production of Forum Communications Company. Got a question, comment, or suggestion? Send me an email at rport@forumcom.com. That's forumcom with 2 M's.com. If you haven't subscribed to Plain Talk yet, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For those of you who are already hooked, give us a rating or review. And don't forget to share or tell a friend. Special thanks to my co-host Chad Oban, and from myself and everyone at Plain Talk, thanks for listening. I hope I didn't just admit to vote fraud.